Hello, this is Lynn Fraser with the Kilby Center for Recovery and the Radical Recovery Summit. And I'm really happy to be here today with Dr. Harvey Milkman. And he has been at the leading edge of addiction recovery and innovative ways to work with this. And so, why don't we start just by you could introduce yourself a little bit and say, how did you get to where you are now? But also, what led up to you've got three really interesting major projects that I'd like to talk about: Iceland, the prison, and the arts programs that you're involved with. So, how did you get to here?
Well, firstly, I'm a professor emeritus at Metropolitan State University of Denver, and up until the COVID time, I've been teaching classes, abnormal psychology, and a course called Cravings and Addictions, which I wrote the book for,
Hmm.
called Craving for Ecstasy and Natural Highs: A Positive Approach to Mood Alteration. And it really puts a lot of my life work together, going back to the mid 60s in New York City, and looking at addiction from a different perspective. So, should we start there and talk about how that
Yeah,
evolved?
interesting.
So, go back to 1966 to 69, graduate student at Michigan State University, a PhD student, and then doing an internship from 1969 to 1970 at Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital in New York City. And during that time, a lot of people were discovering psychedelic drugs, and certainly marijuana. It was a really like kind of a drug revolutionary period that the youth didn't believe anything that the government was saying, so they didn't believe the Vietnam War, and they didn't believe in racial justice, and so they didn't believe that drugs were bad. So there was a lot of going on, and a lot of energy towards taking drugs. And so I was influenced. I was in that period of my life, and people around me were smoking a lot of pot and experimenting with psychedelics and so on. So as an intern, one of my teachers, William Frosch, who was the associate medical director at Bellevue at the time, presented a paper at Grand Rounds at the psychiatric hospital, and he presented before professionals in nursing and psychiatry and psychology and sociology, and there was a place where they would present new ideas. And his idea was that people were taking drugs because they had different drugs for different personality reasons. That why would one person take acid, another person cocaine, another person heroin? They must have different personalities because the drugs have such different effects. And
Mhm.
I sat through that lecture as a person in my 20s, and I said, Dr. Frosch, I think we can research that. And he said, go ahead. You can use all my contacts in New York. You can use the hospital in New York City. And how do you want to do that? And so that's where it all got started.
Oh, cool. So, when I think about taking drugs, mostly I think about I just want to get high.
Right.
You're saying there's a little bit more specificity around that. People want to get high in a certain way.
Right. How do you want to get high? Do you want to be mellow? Do you want to be activated? Do you want to be, spiritual or feeling some sort of connection with the universe? I mean, how do you want to be high? And so those were the questions we began to ask: is who wants to be high in what way? And
Right.
Dr. Frost said, how do you want to do it? And he was a mentor to me, and he still is a mentor, and we still talk about these kinds of things. And I did some thought about it, and I didn't take it lightly. And I had already known about what good research was, and you want to choose a preparation that makes sense. You don't want to make it so unlikely that you'll find results. So I didn't want to use alcohol because everybody drinks alcohol. And I didn't want to use pot because so many people were using pot. So I took two drugs that were very disparate in terms of their effects and very relatively limited populations that were using them: heroin and amphetamine. And I said, Dr. Bill, I want to. He said, how do you want to do it? And I said, I had already done a lot my master's thesis, and I knew that I didn't want to do for my doctorate what I had done for my master's, giving a lot of paper and pencil tests and inventories and questionnaires. I didn't really believe these instruments. And so I said, I want to, and I was influenced by people like Stanley Milgram, who were doing the obedience to authority studies and telling people they were getting electric shocks. And then there was the Milgram study, the Phillips and Bardo studies, where the Stanford Prison Experiment. There was a time in psychology which was very experiential. I said, because so I wanted, it was my turn, and I said, let's give people their drugs of choice. Give them the drugs that they take, and let's talk to them when they're high and when they're straight, and find out, why are they taking these drugs? And he said, yeah, we can do that. We do research on amphetamine at the hospital, but for things like narcolepsy and which is sleep disorder, and sometimes it was being used for excessive weight gain, and so we could give people amphetamine. And he said, but we can't give heroin. And I said, why not? You're an M deity, right? M deities can do things. He said, no, it's illegal. If you were in England, you could do it, but you can't do it in the United States. But he said, we can give them morphine. I said, okay, that sounds like that's good enough. So we recruited people who were abusing these drugs, heroin and amphetamine, and we invited them to get a dose of their favorite drug. And plus, Michigan State was also, my graduate school, and they were in favor of doing creative research, and they gave me $10 per subject per interview. So they could come in and get their favorite drug plus $10 to do an interview while they were high or when they were straight. And so we interviewed them under those two conditions. And it was a triple blind study. So they didn't know whether they were getting the drug or not getting the drug. And I didn't know who was getting the drug as I was rating these interviews with people who were considered normal, people who were considered users of heroin, and people considered users of amphetamine. And we had a pretty clean study, and we were able to get 10 subjects in each category and interview them twice and then analyze the results. And we found out that they really did have different personalities. So the people who were using stimulants were active confrontational types. They were people who were radical politicians, they were musicians, they were construction workers. When they were under stress, they wanted to do something. And, if you were a person who would likely to use stimulant drugs, if you had trouble with your boss, you'd probably wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, clean the refrigerator, and call your boss at 6 o'clock before either you got to. You wanted to take action. And if you were a person who was favorable towards heroin, it was the opposite. You wanted to shut down stimulation. Get out of my face, don't talk to me, pass the food under the door, no sound, no light. I want to shut down. I want to shut myself down when I'm under stress. So I started writing that up, and we published an article in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease in 1973, and it was about the drug abuser's chosen drug, and we described those different characteristics. And I wrote the phrase that the drug of choice is harmonious with your characteristic way of reducing stress. So if you're a person who relieves stress in one way, you gravitate towards one drug or another drug. And then we started thinking about psychedelics, and fantasy is also a way of reducing stress, to step out of kind of the world as it is and to go into a fantasy. So that became the sort of third drug of choice with the psychedelics. And so that really launched my career, that article. It was, people asked for reprints from all over the world. It was somehow, there was a void that was filled because nobody really had addressed that position of drug of choice. So that's how it all started.
Oh, that's really cool. So where did it go from there? So you get your PhD.
Now I have a kind of a reputation of having some expertise in this field. The National Institute of Drug Abuse is asking me to write an article about, comparing. Mine was considered a psychodynamic theory of drug use, tying it back to childhood ego states and, how people grow up and what they need to do to cope, and comparing it to biological theories and sociological theories. And there was a whole journal put out, a monograph about, different drugs, different ways of understanding drug use. In my article, then they asked us to address 5 points. Why do people start using drugs? Why do they continue using drugs? When do they reach a threshold to abuse? When do they stop, and when do they relapse? Those were the 5 questions. So, okay, why do they start using drugs? Everybody who's listening to this broadcast would have an answer to that. There's availability, there's curiosity, there's risk taking. Maybe there's a certain amount of alienation, depression. So that's why they start. Why do they continue? Well, that's where the Milkman Frosh study shines. They continue because they find a drug that fits like a glove in a hand. It's like the drug of choice. It matches their personality. It's something they've always been looking for, something that makes them feel how they always wanted to feel when they're under stress. It gives them an extra, turbocharges them for stress. So that is why they continue. But when do they reach a threshold to abuse? That became the interesting question. So don't forget the year of the early 70s, and now President Carter is also examining the legalization of marijuana at that time. And I wasn't willing to say that if you smoke pot, you're automatically on the threshold to abuse. If you're, or if you drink alcohol, or if you have a, so when do you get to the threshold to abuse? One of the secretaries of Health Education and Welfare, he gave a talk, and he said cigarette smoking was suicide in slow motion. And I thought that was such an interesting idea, that so when do they start committing suicide was the question that I was sort of looking at in terms of thresholds. When does it start really going down? When do people really start taking themselves down with whatever drug they choose to take? And so the act of taking it was not sufficient for me to think that they were on that sort of trajectory of destroying their lives. So then that's where the lights went on, and the epiphany, the big epiphany from my current work came about. So they could be on that threshold to abuse before they ever take the drug. In other words, if they have, like, say, a predilection towards arousal or relaxation or fantasy, they could be relying on those ego states before they even took the drug. So they could be on the threshold to abuse. And people tell me we were stealing hubcaps. We liked the rush of it. And then we started stealing radios. And it wasn't enough. Then we started stealing cars. And so then we discovered cocaine. But we were on that sort of trajectory before we even discovered the drug. So we were on a threshold to abuse. So then I started talking to, what turned out to be a major life partner, friend, and collaborator, Dr. Stanley Sunderworth, who was a brain scientist and the Dean of Science and Math at Metropolitan State University of Denver. I said, Stan, I think people are getting addicted not to the drug, but to their style of coping. I think they're getting addicted to that. And you know what he said in 1 second? He said, yeah, they're getting addicted to changes in the brain chemistry. That's what they're getting addicted to. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, yeah, addicted to changes in brain chemistry. And he said, come in, I want to show you something. So we came into his office, and he took out a letter from his brother-in-law, who was wanting him to go to Siberia with him and release all the Bengal tigers who were captured. And he wanted to actually bring them back to Siberia. He wanted to go to the zoos in the United States. And he said, my brother-in-law has what they call schizophrenia, but it's an example of Pazuzu neurotransmission. I said, what are you talking about? I mean, your brother-in-law, he feels victimized. It's a metaphor. He wants somebody to help, protect him. It's a metaphor for his own. He said, no. He looked and he showed me all these articles about, excess dopamine and schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. And then we started talking about, the problems with dopamine and substance abuse and how people are craving these kinds of neurochemicals in order to change their state of mind. And so then we started thinking about, well, if that's the case, if people are really trying to change their neurochemistry, either by inducing more endorphins or serotonin or norepinephrine or dopamine or GABA, then why not? And the brain is a giant pharmaceutical that makes its own mind-altering chemicals. Why not get people to change their brain chemistry in healthy ways, and if that's what they want to do, and not rely on this sledgehammer of drugs? So I came up with this idea in a kind of an epiphany of, natural highs. Why don't we have people think about getting high in natural ways, and then they don't have to be so destroyed by these kinds of toxic chemical substances. So that's where it all started.
Wow, that's really cool. Wow. So did the arts program start then, or what was your next kind of big step?
Well, the next step was, okay, this seems like the way to go. So then 1987, I decided I want to ask the state of Colorado to put on a Natural Highs conference to bring people from all over the country together to talk about natural highs as a way of, combating substance use. So the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Division of the state of Colorado provided some funding to put on these natural highs conferences, and I collaborated with Alex Hunter, the district attorney for Boulder County. And what better place to do something like that than Boulder, Colorado? And so we put on a natural highs conference and we invited, and actually, so how can you induce natural highs? Well, the obvious thing is sports, and everybody. But I was thinking it's too much sports. We're overemphasized. A lot of kids don't want to do sports. A lot of people they need other ways. We can't just have a one-trick pony and just rely on sports all the time. So night basketball isn't going to do it for everybody. So how else can you get to feel good? And then that sort of things about the arts and humanities. I mean, writing and poetry and art and music and dance. So they became the logical sort of companion pieces to athletics and vigorous physical activity. So we invited people like Betty Edwards, who wrote a book called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, to be a keynote speaker for art as a natural high. We had the director of the Naropa Philharmonic Orchestra in Boulder talking about music as a natural high. We had Frank Shorter, who won the Olympic marathon in Munich, talking about running as a natural high. We had people from Olympic athletes, weightlifters, and all coming together. And we even had the precursor to Whole Foods donating natural highs lunches. So we had lunches according to your preferred personality type. So if you're an arousal type, we give you like a protein lunch. If you're a relaxation type, we give you a carbohydrate lunch. If you were a fantasy type, we give you some, very chocolatey, some very rich sort of, luxury dessert type of lunch. So we had a lot of fun, and people were jumping into the swimming pool at 12 o'clock at night, midnight, and having natural highs, and music was going. And we did it for 2 years in a row, and had people. Herb Benson came out the second year and did a talk on meditation as a physiological bridge to natural highs. And he was the Harvard researcher who kind of broke through on transcendental meditation. He was the one who said, why don't you just say the word one to yourself? You don't necessarily need a mantra. You can do meditation. I know you're familiar with meditation, but he was the one who talked about, kind of a more secular meditation. So he came out, and we had. And then I took all that information. I wrote a grant. I said, well, okay, why not give some of our most vulnerable populations a segue into natural highs? I mean, who are the most vulnerable people? Among them are certainly teenagers. So those are the ones that really are going to be most vulnerable to drug use and interruption of their life trajectory. So I wrote a grant to the Center for Substance Abuse Prevention, and I asked them for $1.2 million for a 4-year national demonstration grant for natural highs. And you know what? They didn't like that term, natural highs. They didn't want to, they stayed away from, they didn't like that natural high. They didn't like the word high, which I still think is a good thing to tell people about, to think about natural ways of feeling good. But they rejected it. And they said, they found some things that they said were wrong with it. But I think they really didn't like that title. And I read their reviews, and I looked at it and I said, they're writing things that aren't really true about what's wrong with this grant. Mm-hmm. And I called them up. I had enough perseverance. I said, I don't think your reviewers were really playing square with this. And they said, okay, we'll look at it again. And I changed the title from Natural Highs to Project Self-Discovery. And then I was awarded $1.2 million. And I don't think I changed hardly any of the words to it. But that was how, the words mean something, and how who's reading it and subjectivity of it. So we had that 4-year national demonstration grant that became, started in 1992. And then we ran that for 10 years from 1992. And we gave kids, and we had great results. We had a great evaluation. Dr. Ken Wanberger is one of the great evaluation scientists in the field of social sciences, and he evaluated the program over that period, and we had great instruments and great sort of ways of talking to the family members, the students, staff, and we could demonstrate that they really were getting better in terms of their family life, they had reduced use of drugs, they had more improved psychological well-being, and so that became a model that really was a joy to be able to put that together. And I still have contact. I mean, some of those kids are 40 years old now that we started working with, but it was an incredible experience. And so we were able to bring that to places like Iceland and Peru and other places to talk about natural highs. And so that was one sort of piece of it. And Iceland was really influenced by that, and they decided to do it. Why wait till they're teenagers? So one of the young sociologists that I had some influence with, she was young, and she went off on her own. She said, "Oh, let's give them ways of feeling good when they're children, when they're like 5 and 6 years of age. Why should we wait till they're having trouble?" So they started this really nationwide program of giving kids healthy alternatives from very young in their school age, and that became an international model. And it's now called Planet Youth.
Mm. Well, that's really it's exciting to know that your work has gone so wide. There must be something really true about what you discovered and that approach, or it wouldn't be standing the test of time in so many different cultures and times. And
Well, it's also an idea that time was society was ready for that. I mean, there was a zeitgeist for looking at alternative ways of thinking about drugs and to get away from this sort of cookie cutter model that people have been pursuing for decades. And Reefer Madness had run its course, and people were trying to look at it differently. So I was at the right place at the right time, I think.
mm. But Iceland has quite a different culture than the United States and the war on drugs and all of that. Can you talk a little bit more about Iceland? So what the situation, some of the statistics are pretty stark in terms of the amount of drinking and what was going on with teenagers. And they made some radical changes like curfews up to a certain age. Why don't you just kind of explain that a little bit for people?
Well, you would think that they're very different from us, but really they're kind of situated halfway between Europe and the U.S. And they do take a lot from the U.S. and they're really not exactly European, and they're certainly not American, but they do respect and follow. And so they were influenced by the Just Say No and Nancy Reagan and the Dare campaign. They were doing all that, and it didn't work. I mean, they found that it was just doing no real benefit, was not benefiting them. The drug use kept going up. 42% of the teenagers were getting really badly drunk every month, and really doing damage to the social life in Iceland. And they got tired of it, and they really got. And they're very good, responsible. They're very a lot of them. They have the highest literacy rate in Iceland in the world, and they have also, with all these problems that you look at with suicide or drinking, they also have the longest lifespan. They're not like a culture that is down, really downtrodden. They're a very rich and vibrant and alive and intelligent group of people. So, and there's not that many of them. There's only 330,000 people in the whole country of Iceland. So it's a pretty small pop, and it's also very homogeneous. There's a lot of Icelanders who were born and raised, and there's not that many immigrants that come to live in Iceland. So they had the capacity to make some kind of choices without a lot of argument, because they see things in a much more homogeneous way than we do. They don't argue. When they see something, they think they go embrace it. And also, it's the more of a social welfare system. So the government was willing to put more into it than in some other, places where it's more, less involved in social welfare practices. So they were able to do that. So they decided that we're going to do something about it. We don't want our streets polluted by kids getting drunk and sick on the streets and being boisterous and sometimes dangerous. So they instituted a questionnaire. Was probably the most sort of let's say useful element of their change process. So they have a Youth in Iceland survey, and they would survey the kids every year and ask them what was happening in their social life and their drug taking, what kind of drugs were they taking, their anxiety levels, their school experiences, their family life. Just a 75 questionnaire, but in an hour or so, it's amazing how much information you can get about a kid. And the other thing is the kids tell you stuff that you wouldn't believe how honest they are about their lives. I mean, I've done, presided over more than 2,000 of these surveys, and the knee-jerk responses, they're not going to tell you the truth, but they don't have the same kind of filters that adults do. They tell you a lot. I mean, some kids won't, but a lot of them really tell you. So you get a real sense of what's going on in their lives. And then we understood how many kids were getting drunk, what proportion of them, what. And we could look at things like how much time were they spending with their family, how much time, how did they feel in the neighborhood, in the schools, and so on. And we discovered that there were certain sort of markers of risk that predicted their drug use. One was how much time they were spending with their family. It was a direct relationship between how many nights a week you have with dinner with your kid versus, how many times a month are you getting drunk. And so there was that. We saw that from the data, and also we saw, that people who were not participating in sports or in other kinds of extracurricular activities had a much higher level of substance abuse. So we were able to look at that data, and we also looked at how late they were staying out at night. And the kids that were staying out unsupervised at night had a much higher rate. So we looked at all that data, and we were able to put together a program that sort of capitalized on that information. One was based on curfew. If you're 16 years of age or younger, you can't be out after 10 o'clock at night, even though the sun doesn't set until like midnight in the summertime. But you have to have a reason for being out, either to supervise or going to some concert with adults who are. And it's not a police state. Iceland doesn't arrest you if you're, who talks to your parents or walking the streets and they say, "What are you doing out? You shouldn't be out now. Or I'm going to call your mother. I mean, what's going on here?" And so it's not like police are going to arrest people. So it's more of a friendly sort of a kind of this is what we're doing. This is what we do in Iceland. So the kids get that idea. So when the kid says, "Mom, I want to go out," and she says, "No," and she says, people don't do that. We don't. And then everybody knows it. The media was very cooperative. They published those kinds of information in newspapers, on television, radio. Everybody knows that curfew exists. Everybody also knows in Iceland that it's a matter of how much time you spend. It's not just quality of time, it's quantity of time. So people know that now. They don't argue with that. So even though you may be working two jobs, which people in Iceland do, they have the same kind of economic difficulties that we have in Canada or the US. It's, a lot of people trying to make ends meet. And so, but they make time for their kids. They understand that. But probably the biggest thing is the after school activities and the leisure card. So the government and the practitioners and the policymakers, they all got together and they said, and the researchers, they said, what are we going to do? How are we going to get these kids to? So they decided to create a leisure card, which gives every child in Iceland approximate 400 euros per child per day, per family, per year. So in other words, every family gets an allocation of 400 euros, which is approximately $500 per kid per year to enroll them in an activity like sports or music or dance or art. And they all know that. And it's not like they can take the money and use it to buy drugs because it's all on the computer. And they're very computer literate in Iceland. So it's like vouchers. So they know that they can register their kids on the computer for this program class or that class. And, something like 90-something% of the kids who are 6 years old are registered in these classes. And so it goes all the way up to 16, 17 years of age. They participate at enormously high rates in these kinds of after school activities. And it works. And they're very, and I'm considering myself an honorary Icelander. We beat England in the European Games in soccer. We tied Argentina in the World Games in last year and with the World Cup. And so, I mean, imagine a little country like that. And sometimes they have a wink and a smile. They say it's because of these programs that we have. So.
Wow. So what I find interesting is that the whole country just kind of went, something's not working. Let's look at it. And what you came up with, what made sense. And so then they went, so let's try it.
They went into it big time and they put their own spin on it, and it really worked internationally. And so I was also, maybe some of the work that brought you to me was, I wrote an article about it in the Huffington Post. I think it was 2017. I said, "This is amazing what Iceland is doing. It's incredible." And I wrote that article, and then it went viral. It went all over the world. And then the Mosaic in Britain picked it up, and then it went into places like the Atlantic Monthly, and it went all over the world. And they're talking about the Iceland model. So it became something that people really got the wind of around the world, and that sort of brought it into another perspective. And I think I'm proud of that because it was quite genuine. I mean, I wasn't thinking about making it bigger. I just thought this is incredible what's happening here. I just have to write about this, and so you never know what's going to happen.
True. So, I think we have an intuitive sense that people who are using drugs and other any kind of addiction, there's some element of escape and comfort of distress, and trauma really fits into it. And then there's so much shame once people start using, and so much pressure. So what's your thinking around shame and childhood trauma? And I mean, this is such a positive approach, but
Right,
it should be still rooted in that understanding of these are some of the issues here, and how are we going to do
right.
something, you know?
Well, one thing is, I mean, people don't like to be pathologized, and they don't want to think of themselves as deviant or sick or So the thing that Project Self Discovery taught me with the 10 years of working with it, and the kids were really only selected because they had problems with criminal justice system, with the mental health system, school system. We didn't take kids who were doing well. We took kids who were really, having problems.
Mhm.
And so, but you know what? We never labeled them as kids who were mental health kids or substance abuse. We didn't, and they didn't want to see themselves that they were coming in to do an arts program. They weren't coming into a mental health center or to a probation office where they were going to get therapy. They were getting stuff that made them feel good, and they felt, and they weren't identified. They weren't sort of singled out as these are the kids that have mental health problems or criminal justice problems, and they were kids that wanted to learn art and music and dance, and we would give them whatever they wanted. And I learned that from a British study called Summerhill. I don't know if you ever ran into that, but it was a book written in the 60s. We studied it in graduate school where the researcher brought kids who had problems with authority and brought them to a school in called Summerhill in England, and let them. They didn't have to take any classes that they didn't want. They could take whatever they wanted. They could take math or English, whatever they wanted. And then he got great results where the kids were moved away from delinquency into a more socialized way because they had choices about what they were doing. And I picked up on that. I said, if they want to learn hip hop, give them hip hop. They want to learn martial arts, they want to lose music. Let's just give them whatever they want. And they all wanted to learn something like that. They wanted to do something that was creative, and they had that spirit also. So not to pathologize it. I think is a big deal in terms of going towards a more healthy way of working with these problems.
Right, right. And it
But there
really
is, but I want to touch on the trauma. I mean, I think you mentioned interviewing people like Gabor Mate and others, and talking about what we all know is that there is a trauma core, and so many of the people who are using drugs. But I think we know something about trauma too, is that you don't have to be a trauma specialist to help people with trauma. So you don't have to be someone who goes, certainly you don't want to have a voyeuristic window into what happened with them if you're working with kids. If you offer a reliable, constructive environment with a caring, sort of nurturing team of people who are sensible and reliable and consistent, you do a lot towards resolving that trauma by not even talking about the trauma. And
right.
so that's something that really we know. Some people really need to go into it, but many people, when they're exposed to a group of people who have authority and they're not abusing them, they're not taking advantage of them, they're reliable and consistent and caring, they get better a lot. And so that we were able to do that without bringing them into trauma recovery centers or things of that sort. And most of them did have trauma in their backgrounds.
Right. So the inconsistency and betrayal and hurt that they suffered from the adults in their life prior to this was kind of healed just by this safe, consistent connection.
Yeah, and when I talk to former gang members and people who had, you know, people who had addiction to everything that you can imagine under the sun, I say, how did you get better? And almost every time I get the same answer is that somebody cared about me. And that's kind of what it boils down to, is to make those linkages with people that they connect with and who reach out to them. And I wrote an article called Better Than Dope that I published in Psychology Today about Project Self-Discovery. And it was interesting. The editor said, well, this is a great, I called it Project Self-Discovery, Artistic Alternatives to Drugs and Crime. And she said, it's not interesting. People are going to get bored. They're not going to read that. I said, I'll give you something sexy. Let's call it Better Than Dope. And she said, okay, that's it. So then 1,000,000 copies went out with that. But how did I come up with that term? Because one of my students in the program, one of the participants, he had a lot of problems with alcohol. He used LSD regularly. He had, failure in school. He was shot in a gang thing, but he was a great artist. He was a graffiti artist. And he would take me around looking at the graffiti in Denver, and he'd say, Harvey, what do you think about that? What would they say about that? He was like really very involved with what people thought about the art. And he came out of that art class one day. Loretta was his art teacher. She was like a grandma. She had all gray hair. She was probably close to 70 at the time. And he said, she's an angel. She's an angel. She could help him turn his art into like professional art and help him frame it and stuff. And he said, he came out of that class one day and he said, Harvey, it's dope. It's dope. And I knew what he was talking about. It was better than dope. It was like a drug. It was his drug of choice. And to this day, we're friends. That kid and I are friends. And he became a tattoo artist. He has a very, vibrant career as a tattoo artist. But that's what happened to him. But it was better than dope. So that was the title of that article in Psychology Today, Better Than Dope. So what is better than dope? Right. What is better than dope? I mean, is there anything better than dope? If you have meaningful engagement of talents, if you can engage yourself in a way that has meaning and purpose and makes you feel good, then it's better.
Right. Right. Being kind of written off as a loser or a troubled kid.
Right. That's right. And this whole field of motivational interviewing that has, been a revolution in psychology. I mean, when people have their own reasons to change. I mean, we don't have to give them all the reasons that they should change. They know themselves. I mean, even the kids who are teenagers who are having these problems, they sensed that it was a good idea to get something else going for them. And when they saw that ring on the merry-go-round, they grabbed for it because they knew that there was a possibility there that they didn't want to pass up. So people have their own reasons to change, and you don't have to lock them up, tell them that they're going to die if they don't do it. They understand a lot of that.
Right. Yeah. The whole war on drugs and just say no. A lot of that was so shame based.
Yeah, that's right. So we have a program in Colombia. The country of Colombia had it, and it has a very interesting. Can I mention that a little bit? Yeah, sure. It's a wonderful program. It's called Tiempo de Juego, which means game time in Spanish. And I think I feel a kinship with the originators of the program. It was about a decade ago that one of the journalists walked into the urban settlement. Some people might call it slums. We call it urban settlements outside of Bogota. And people, they squat, they build little shacks, and they live there without paying rent. And thousands of people. It's like the favelas in Brazil. And he walked into that settlement. He started kicking a woolen, like a makeshift ball. It wasn't even a regular ball. And he noticed that the kids got into it. They liked to kick the ball with him. And he started this idea of football for peace. And they started they had some philosophy where they would make up their own rules, but it had to be something like pro-social. So a goal wouldn't count unless a girl kicked the first goal. Or you'd have to celebrate the other team if they kicked the goal. So they would make up their rules, and then they'd have fun doing that. And after the game was played, they'd discuss what worked and what they wanted to carry on to the next round of it. So pretty soon they had thousands of kids kicking these soccer balls around in these slums. And then they had grandmas making snacks for them and watching them play and making these, and it became like a movement where they call it game time. And then they started introducing art and music and dance to the kids, and it's a model program. And so there were thousands, like they did what I did on steroids. They did Project Self Discovery on steroids in this neighborhood, this city outside of Bogota that's really urban settlements. And so I collaborate with them, and we do work together, and we talk about brain chemistry and natural highs, and we talk to right up to the head of the government about. We're having a podcast going to be put together in the next couple of weeks about talking with the Minister of Sports and a researcher from Harvard and myself talking about these natural highs opportunities that are being developed in Colombia. And so it's exciting to do that kind of work. In the COVID time, the kids can't get out and do these collaborative. South America's hit harder in some ways than many places in the world. So it's not so easy to get people together in collaborative group experiences. So we wrote a collaborative grant with Tiempo de Juego to see how social media could be used to influence kids to make healthy choices around how they're going to have natural highs given in the COVID period. So that's something that we're working on right now, is how can you influence kids given the fact that we can't do the same kinds of activities in the way that we've been doing them.
Hmm. Have you got any kind of preliminary ideas about how you might do that?
Yeah, we have a group in Boulder it's called Natural Highs, and influenced by the work that I initiated. And we have a Natural Highs group that has high school kids, and they go out and they talk to other high school kids. But they meet regularly, and they put on Natural Highs events, and they show how, talking and dancing and art and music, and we have activities that, simple things that you can do to show how you can laugh and have a lot of laughter without taking drugs. And some of these kids, when they get exposed to that, it's the first time they ever laughed without drugs in their system. But some simple things that you can do that are, like, very simple thing is, if we play that simple game of red light, green light, and you say, okay, when I say red, when I say go, you go. When I say stop, you stop, and then you reverse it. You say, when I say stop, you go. When I say go, you stop. And then when I say clap, you clap. And when I say jump, you jump. And then we're going to reverse it. When I say clap, you jump. When I say jump, you clap. And then you got these kids running around. They're laughing and giggling. They can't exactly. They say, well, you're getting sort of high on your own brain chemistry. You're having fun with just, playing around with how you can think about things. And so we have ways of doing it. We have hundreds of exercises to bring kids into feeling good without drugs.
Mhm, mhm.
And they get it and they understand it.
Yeah. So the common denominator here just seems to be connection, which is something that people have started talking about more in the last, 5 years, maybe a lot more about disconnection and drug use, or connection as a
Yeah,
kind of. So what would you have to say about that? Is that kind of the theme that's running through all of this?
I
Fun.
think so, Lynn. I really think so. I think, somehow my mind works, and I somehow step out of the, like a very traditional way of thinking about things. And I think about, like, I thought about, why do people, in the name of some sort of religious extremism or some kind of a, cult, why do they do crazy things to each other? And to me, that's a type of addiction. I talk about that in my book, about addiction to fantasy. Obviously, if something makes you feel good and takes you out of some trauma state,
Right.
you can get addicted to your own thinking too. So I put on a conference at my university called "When Faith and Violence Coincide." How can you justify committing violence in the name of some sort of religious belief system? And I had people from around the country coming to talk about this question. And one of the people that came to my attention as I was directing this conference was a girl she fell in love with an ISIS fighter, and she was flying to Turkey to marry the ISIS fighter and then to go to Syria and to become part of the ISIS family. And her mother was a biology professor at one of the universities here in Colorado, and they intercepted her. The FBI somehow got her at the airport, and then they brought her back, and they tried her for some sort of collusion with ISIS, and they put her in jail for I'm not sure how long. But I interviewed her mother before, and her mother said she didn't need to go to jail. She didn't have connections. She didn't have connections. She was isolated. There was nobody that she had to talk to, and so you brought that point up, and that was a very salient sort of experience that I had. Yes, I think that's it. I mean, if we make, and that's what Iceland has become, exquisite at, is even if the kids' parents are drinking or having other kinds of mental health problems, if they have that connection with other kids and with other healthy mentors, it makes all the difference in the world. I mean, it can, if you take that field of epigenetics, it can reverse like even genetic trends going in the wrong direction. If you make that nurturing human connection, it can bring out a whole positive brain development in the brain. So that's a big part of it.
Well, and it really doesn't say much good about the nuclear family and the kind of pressures that people are under to, parents who have
Right.
trauma and their own addictions, and then kids are just kind of lost, and that's been going on for generations.
Yeah, and I think, Lynn, pragmatically, I mean, if we can't really rely on the nuclear family to do it, then it behooves us to figure out other ways of doing it. If the nuclear family can't always be the nuclear family that we want it to be, that we idealize it at, then we have
Mhm.
a responsibility as a society to figure out ways of nurturing kids so that they don't become victimized of a dysfunctional family.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So, so if someone's sitting here going, "Yes, this is it. We need to do this." How do they go from there? Like, what are some ideas you might have about that?
Well, I think, well, one thing, I'm at this stage of my life where I am interested in collaboration. So if people want to contact me, I mean, the meter doesn't go on, the cash register doesn't go on. I mean, I'm happy to talk to people about these kind of, and if there's a community out there that, wants to pay my airfare and give me a hotel room, I'm happy to do that. I mean, so to talk about, I mean, it needs a little bit more than just a half hour, you know,
Right.
interview. But there are a lot of ways that we can learn about how to pursue these kinds of mechanisms and methods, and we can get started with it. And really, what it takes, I think, for a community to go forward is to identify a core group of stakeholders that consist of people who are interested in research, policymakers, and people who work with kids. And it could be a handful of kids, like Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a small group of people can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that it ever has. I mean, so if you get a small group of people together that want to do something and then, create this momentum where you can have a conference or a meeting. And I mean, I've done it in communities, and I did it in the whole country of New Caledonia. We ignited the whole country to do this by starting out with a small group of people that wanted to have public talks about it. And then we got people mobilized, and it can be done. So it takes a small group of people to have the initiative to put together, some conferences about this, and then have people get bigger and bigger, and then it reaches a critical mass, and then before you know it, something is being done.
Well, and I was just thinking about what you said about in Iceland, it's the parents who are just kind of out in the streets after curfew and just kind of connecting with the kids, so it's not an arrest process. They're
No,
not.
it's nothing like, it's not like, reefer madness where, people are going to go to hell if they use a drug. It's
Right.
compassion and caring and understanding and warmth, and somehow shepherding people to the right place. It's more like shepherding rather than coercing. So
Right.
that's how it is. Um, but yeah, it takes parent groups. The school is a good ally in this. I mean, the school didn't cause these problems, and it didn't. It's not going to solve these problems. but it's a good way of bringing people together. So when you have the school is able to, yes, agree to put on to have questionnaires administered, so you find out what's going on in the school, and then you can then reach to out to the parents because they have connections to the parents. So the school can become a hub where a lot of this kind of beginning position can take place. And another thing that's important, Lynn, is the local nature of this. I mean, one lesson I learned from Project Self Discovery. I collaborated with a remarkable African American dance choreographer named Cleo Parker Robinson, and people trusted her, and they trusted me, and they brought their kids to us, and we had these thousands of kids. But not every community has a Cleo Parker Robinson and a Harvey Milkman. So, what do you have in your community? So, it has to be local people who have charisma and have relationships that are meaningful to the kids in that community. So it's local, and you use the local talent to figure out how to manage what kind of alternatives you're going to give the kids and who's reaching out to them. The other thing about local, we have a statement in Iceland that I think is very helpful, is that the data is like fresh vegetables. It has to be local and it has to be delivered rapidly. You can't store it up for like 6 months. A lot of times when we do surveys, it takes a year or 2 years before if it ever gets to the people who are working with these kids. Usually it stays in the ivory tower in some journal somewhere. So it has to be fresh and it has to be local and it has to be disseminated because conditions change very quickly. What's happening in Nova Scotia, I promise you, is very different than what's happening in Montreal, what's happening in
Right.
Toronto, or in neighborhoods in Toronto or Montreal. So it has to be, you have to think about the local conditions and then apply remedies within the capacity and the specific risk and protective factors in those local communities. And that's how it works.
Right, right. So I can't believe our time is almost up. So why don't you say your names of your books and your email address? How can people get hold of your website? How can people get in touch?
Okay, I think probably the university email is best for this purpose. So milkmanh@msudenver.edu. So that'll get me through the university. And then the book that I'm really most current with that pertains to this conversation and it's called Craving for Ecstasy and Natural Highs, a positive approach to mood alteration. And that brings together a lot of the things I talked about today, from arousal, relaxation, fantasy, addiction, and then all the positive things you can do: nutrition, exercise, meditation, meaningful engagement of talents, positive relationships, and puts together, what people should be thinking about in terms of how to feel good without taking drugs, and explains all the brain chemistry, the psychology, the sociology, in very readable way. And the students love it. They understand it, and it's not dumb. It's not dumbed down at all, but it's stuff that people can get.
Right, that can understand. Yeah. Yeah.
So so thinking of me, I want to be remembered as an applied psychologist. I never thought psychology was that good if we couldn't use it. I mean, if what do we do with all the information? How do you help people with this? So I've always devoted my life to creating programs that would reach out and connect psychology with populations of people that could benefit.
Right. I'm very much like that teaching meditation as well. If it's not in your daily life, then it's you're missing out on a lot if you're not using it in your own day to day
Yeah,
working with your mind. Yeah.
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 So this has been an opportunity for me, Lynn, with you, and I'm hoping that it is a good interview that we're having and how it.
I'm delighted and really encouraged, as we're recording this, it's just a few days after the announcement of Biden and
Yeah,
Harris being elected. And so there was so much uncertainty and fear. And there's also so much polarization and people wondering how are Americans going to pull together? And so
yes,
what we're talking about, occasionally I would kind of be drifting back to that as we're talking. This is how we come together. Everybody has that impulse to do well and to be connected and to be happy. And a lot of times when that's not really showing up, it's because of fear and, histories of disconnection and pain and to be able to work with something like this is a really positive thing.
yeah, and I think I think for me, you can put this out or not. I think there's more love in the world now after this election. I think people are having a fresh air feeling. And my friends in Europe are saying, "Oh, we have such a relief, Harvey," and I
Mm,
feel that way. I feel like what we aspired to in terms of using science and using humanity, being the virtue of humanity, is now being given another opportunity, and so I think that's an optimistic part of where we are today, and it's not over. I mean, we're not by no means cured of all this stuff, but I
mhm.
think maybe we're on the right path now.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and as a Canadian, I have so many friends in the United States, and so it's personal in a way, but it's also, as a human being, it's really difficult to watch what was going on in the United States.
Oh, it's horrible.
Yeah,
So we have the fingers crossed about the next 2 months. I mean, we know that this is a narcissistically wounded person who we worry about how
right.
those wounds will manifest. So fingers crossed, and maybe you and I will have another talk in a couple of months and say, well, we got the good end of it now. That's what I'm hoping. I bring people together, and I learn from these people that I bring. Like I'm sure you do when you interview all these people, you learn things as you're going along. So I brought Stephanie Covington and Lisa Najovitz, who were doing stuff with trauma. And one thing that they influenced, they put on a conference in Denver that I put together. And one thing they got me to see was that it's very individual how people talk about their trauma and it's a very individual discussion with the therapist. I mean,
Mhm,
there's no really blueprint for exactly how to do this kind of work,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
And it's a very and then I think one thing some people get better just in a group listening to other people talk about their trauma. Other people talk about their trauma. We didn't talk about my work with the criminal justice system. We've written some incredible curricula for teenagers in criminal justice settings, adults, and probably more than 1 million adults have gone through our adult criminal justice, criminal
Wow.
conduct, and substance abuse treatment workbooks and things.
Mhm.
But in the end of the day, it's about the human real connectedness. I don't care what kind of curriculum you've written and what kind of manual they're doing. It's the connection with the counselor, with whoever that person is that makes life click for you. That
And if we can have some fun along the way, that's even
yeah,
better.
yeah, and particularly with teenagers, they like to laugh a lot. And if we can have fun with them, I discovered that. That's if they're having fun, then they want to come back. And
Yeah. Mhm.
so
Well, what a pleasure to get a chance to talk with you, and
thanks for your great work. Thank you.